The Egyptians are a fascinating civilization. They're the earliest settlement along the Nile River. The Nile River is called the gift of the Nile, and you can decide, is it really a gift or not? But we're going to find out in a few minutes. But that is what they called it, so I think that's kind of cool. All right, let's talk about geography and its impact. Because much like the other civilizations that we're going to discuss, geography is going to play a huge role in how these civilizations develop. So we have the Nile River. It's the longest river in the world. It splits into two branches. It flows north, starting in the mountains of Africa, through the deserts, and then empties into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, unlike Mesopotamia, Egypt's geography makes it difficult to invade because you have the Mediterranean Sea to the north, you have the Red Sea to the east, and you have the Sahara to the west. You also had in the south the African mountains and the cataracts. All right, so how did the Nile affect life in ancient Egypt? It's very similar to what you learned with Mesopotamia and those civilizations that developed along the Tigris and Euphrates River. The Nile also flooded on a regular basis. And so what this allowed for, it allowed for people to predict. And so they could use this, they knew when the floods were coming, and they could also develop a systematic way of irrigating crops. The people along the Nile River also developed a calendar system based on the Nile's flood cycle because it could be somewhat predictable. And so they had this calendar and they could almost predict when the floods would come. This also aided in their development of irrigating crops. In Egyptian history, the Old Kingdom was led by King Minos, and he united Upper and Lower Egypt in 3100 BC. King Minos also created the first dynasty. Dynasty is a family of rulers whose right to rule is passed on within the family. King Minos took the title of Pharaoh, and the most common title for an Egyptian ruler is the term Pharaoh. Pharaohs had unlimited power, but they did use a bureaucracy to help guide them, and these are non-elected officials that kind of helped him govern. The Egyptians were polytheistic for the most part. There was a time in their history where they became monotheistic, where they just had one god, and that would be the sun god, but we'll get into that later. But mostly they were polytheistic. Gods were very important, especially the sun and land gods. And they had some characteristics of theocracies in Egypt because the pharaohs were seen as divine leaders, and they were at the center of both religious practices in Egypt and the decisions made by the governing practices. The Egyptians had some really cool cultural characteristics and scientific advancements. They built huge pyramids, and this was a really big achievement for the Old Kingdom, and these were especially important to pharaohs. Oftentimes they would try to outdo each other who could have the best pyramid. They also did something called mummification. They would mummify the dead, and they used all these different surgical techniques that they developed to preserve bodies. And I think probably the pharaohs had probably the highest level of mummification, and you've probably seen that from some of the research that's happened over the years where they've discovered these ancient tombs, these Egyptian tombs, and you can see how these people were preserved, and you get to learn a lot of information about that. And so their mummification process was quite fascinating. They had kind of a simplified version of hieroglyphics, and you can see over here that there's kind of a picture of what I'm talking about. And so that was kind of their way of writing down their thoughts, ideas, beliefs. They also wrote on papyrus, and they made that from reeds that grew along the water area along the Nile, and they also developed a calendar system based on the annual floods from the Nile. They used geometry, they learned to calculate area and volume, and this is how they built those pyramids and those temples. So the Egyptians were really advanced for that time period. So why do you think mummification was so important to the Egyptians? Think about it for a few minutes. Going through that whole process of preserving people. In fact, they would even put people in tombs with some of their belongings. So think about what we've discussed over this presentation and talk with a partner and see if you can determine why this process was so important to the Egyptians. The Middle Kingdom in Egyptian history began around 2050 BC, and they conquered Nubia and they sent armies to Palestine and Syria. They also dug a canal that connected the Nile and the Red Sea to aid in transportation. The Egyptians were invaded by the Hyksos from Western Asia, and they came in on horse-drawn chariots, and they had bronze weapons. And so then came the New Kingdom, where they used these weapons brought by the Hyksos to overthrow them later. And here you can see kind of the social structure where you have the pharaohs up top, and then you have the nobles and the priests here, and then all your farmers and merchants and artisans kind of make up the last big group here. What do you notice about this pyramid, especially right here? It's really the smallest area. It has the fewest amount of people in society. Look at where all the people right down here. So what can you determine from that? So if Egyptian society is like a pyramid, what does that tell you about how people in society were proportioned? It's exactly what we discussed on the slide just before this one.